There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much work you have actually done. You know it if you have ever lain awake at 2 in the morning with a mind that will not stop generating items. The dentist. The email to your sister. The thing your boss said in passing that might have been a request or might have been amusing. The tax document. The birthday. The half-formed idea about your career that you have been half-forming for 3 years. None of these are being worked on at 2 in the morning. All of them are being carried. David Allen's whole argument begins from that specific sensation and from a claim about it that is more radical than it first appears. He says that the stress you feel is not caused by having too much to do. It is caused by having too much undecided. The mind, he argues, is very good at having ideas and very bad at holding them. It has no sense of time, no sense of priority, and no ability to distinguish between a task you can act on right now and one that cannot possibly move for 6 weeks. It will remind you to buy cat food at the least useful moment available, and it will remind you again, because it has no way of knowing you heard it the first time. From this comes the line that anchors the book: there is an inverse relationship between the things on your mind and the things actually getting done. The more you are holding, the less you are moving. That is a strange and slightly insulting proposition, because it suggests that the anxious churning that feels like conscientiousness is in fact the thing preventing the work. Getting Things Done is a book about building an external system trustworthy enough that your mind agrees to let go. Not a book about discipline, not a book about working harder, and not really a book about time. It is a book about attention and about the peculiar cost of unfinished thinking. What follows is a walk through its architecture, its most useful mechanisms, and the places where I think it strains under its own ambitions. David Allen came to this material as a consultant rather than an academic. He spent years working with executives and organizations on personal productivity, which matters because the book reads exactly like what it is: a distillation of thousands of hours spent sitting beside overwhelmed people, watching what they actually did with their paper, their inboxes, and their guilt. The method was refined in the field before it was written down, and it shows in the level of granularity. Allen is interested in where the physical folder goes. He is interested in whether your pen is within reach. This is not a book of principles that leaves implementation to the reader. The implementation is the book. Getting Things Done was first published in 2001 at a very specific historical moment. Email had become universal but had not yet become infinite. Personal digital assistants existed but were clumsy. The smartphone was not yet in anyone's pocket. Knowledge work was expanding into a shape it had never had before, where the boundaries of a job were no longer defined by a task list handed down from above, but by an ambiguous mandate that each worker had to translate into action themselves. Allen's core observation was that this new work had no edges. You could never see the whole of it, you could never be sure you were done, and the traditional tools, which assumed a fixed set of assignments, simply did not fit. The book found an audience that went well beyond its consulting origins. It became a sort of folk operating system for a generation of engineers, writers, and managers, spawning an ecosystem of software, forums, and evangelists who adopted its vocabulary wholesale. The 3-letter acronym became a verb. People spoke of doing a weekly review the way one might speak of going to church. In 2015, Allen published a revised edition, updating the material for a decade in which the technology had transformed underneath it. The revision matters less than you might expect, because the surprising thing about the original is how little of it was actually about tools. Allen was always deliberately agnostic. Paper or software, index cards or an app, he does not much care. The revised edition adjusts examples and acknowledges that the world now carries a networked computer at all times, but the skeleton is unchanged, which is either evidence that the method captured something durable about cognition, or evidence that it was pitched at a level of abstraction general enough to survive anything. I think it is mostly the former. Allen has a vocabulary for the things that occupy you. He calls them open loops, or incompletes, or, most usefully, stuff. Stuff is anything that has entered your world and that you have not yet decided about. The unopened envelope is stuff. The vague sense that you should do something about your parents' living situation is stuff. Stuff is defined not by its size or importance, but by its undecidedness. The crucial insight is that stuff is psychologically expensive in a way that decided commitments are not. When you have made a real decision about something, including a decision about where the reminder lives and what the very next physical step is, the item stops nagging. When you have not, some part of your attention stays permanently allocated to it, running a low-level background process whose only function is to make sure you do not forget. That process does not help you complete anything. It just costs. Alan frames this in terms of agreements. Every open loop is an agreement you have made with yourself, and every agreement you have not kept or renegotiated or explicitly abandoned erodes your self-trust a little. This is the part of the book that is more psychological than procedural, and I think it is the part that explains its unusual emotional grip on readers. Most productivity advice treats the reader as a machine running at insufficient throughput. Alan treats the reader as someone in a slightly strained relationship with themselves. The system exists to repair that relationship by making the agreements visible and therefore renegotiable. You are allowed to decide that you will never learn the piano. You are not allowed to keep half deciding it every few weeks for the rest of your life. There is a further implication that I find genuinely liberating. If the anxiety comes from undecidedness rather than from volume, then you do not need to do more in order to feel better. You need to decide more. Those are very different projects, and only one of them is available to a person who is already exhausted. Alan does not ask you to take this on faith. He opens with a small demonstration that takes about 2 minutes and works with unnerving reliability. Pick something that is currently on your mind. Not the most important thing, but the most annoying, distracting, or nagging thing. Something with an unclear outcome or an undefined next step. Then write down, in a single sentence, what a successful outcome would look like. What would have to be true for you to consider this finished and off your plate? Then write down the very next physical action required to move it forward. Not the project, not the strategy, the next thing you would actually do with your hands or your voice or your keyboard. Then notice how you feel. What almost everyone reports is a small but distinct release. Nothing has been accomplished. The task is exactly as undone as it was 90 seconds earlier. And yet something has shifted because the mind was not holding a task at all, it was holding an unresolved question. 2 questions, in fact. What does done look like, and what does doing look like? Answer both and the loop closes, not because the work is complete, but because the thinking is. I want to dwell on this because it is the entire book in miniature. Everything that follows, all the lists and folders and reviews, is scaffolding to make this 2-minute move repeatable at scale, for hundreds of items, reliably, forever. The insight is small. The infrastructure required to apply it consistently is not. It also reframes what procrastination is. We tend to treat procrastination as a failure of will, and sometimes it is. But a startling proportion of the time, the reason a task has sat untouched for weeks is that it is not a task at all. It is a vague noun. Sort out insurance. Deal with the website. These are not things a human being can do. Nobody has ever performed the action of dealing with the website. Once you convert it into call the broker and ask whether the policy covers contents in transit, resistance often evaporates because the ambiguity that was generating the resistance is gone. The first of the 5 steps is capture, and it is the most physically demanding because it is not selective. Alan wants everything. Every scrap of paper, every note, every idea, every drawer full of postponed decisions, every item in every email inbox, and crucially every thought currently resident in your head. He calls the initial version of this a mind sweep, and it is meant to be exhaustive to the point of absurdity. If it is generating even a flicker of attention, it goes in. The tools required are unglamorous. An inbox, physical or digital, where incoming things land. A trash can. A filing system for reference material. A calendar. A set of lists. That is essentially it, and Alan is insistent that the sophistication of the tools is close to irrelevant next to the consistency of their use. 2 design constraints matter. First, you should have as few capture points as you can get away with, but as many as you need. Too many inboxes and none of them is trustworthy. Too few and you fail to capture in the moment because the right container is not at hand. Second, and this is the hard one, every capture point must be emptied regularly, daily, or at minimum weekly. Not completed. Emptied, in the sense that every item in it has been looked at and decided about. Alan is emphatic that emptying your inbox does not mean finishing the work, only that nothing remains undecided. This distinction is where most people's systems die. The inbox becomes a to-do list, which means it becomes a place where decided and undecided items sit together, which means you have to reread everything every time to figure out which is which means you eventually stop looking. Alan's rule is blunt. Do not use your inbox as a to-do list and never put a clarified item back into the inbox. Once it has been decided about, it belongs somewhere else. The inbox is a doorway, not a room. The reason capture must be total, rather than merely thorough, is trust. A system that holds 95% of your commitments does not buy you 95% of the calm. It buys you almost none, because your mind, quite reasonably, will not stand down while it suspects something is missing. Partial capture is close to worthless. This is an unusually harsh threshold effect, and it explains why people who dabble in this method often report that it did nothing for them. They got the mechanics and missed the completeness, and completeness was the active ingredient. Now you have a pile. The second step is where the pile gets metabolized, one item at a time, top to bottom, no cherry picking. You take an item and you ask a sequence of questions, and, depending on the answers, the item exits into one of a small number of destinations. First question: what is it? Second, is it actionable? If it is not actionable, there are exactly 3 possibilities. It is trash and you throw it away, and Alan thinks most people throw away far too little. It is something you might want to do at some point, but not now, in which case it goes on a someday or maybe list, which is a genuinely underrated mechanism because it lets you release something without pretending it does not exist. Or it is information you may need later, in which case it goes into reference, filed somewhere you can retrieve it. Reference material is not work. Alan is firm about keeping the 2 categories apart because a folder that mixes documents you might need with actions you must take will make both feel heavy. If it is actionable, the questions get sharper. What is the desired outcome? If achieving it requires more than one step, it is a project, and it goes on a projects list, which is simply an inventory of open commitments, not a plan. Then, whether or not it is a project, what is the next action? Here Alan introduces the rule that has escaped the book and entered general culture. If the next action would take less than about 2 minutes, do it immediately. The reasoning is purely economic. The overhead of tracking, storing, and revisiting a trivial item costs more than the item itself. Below that threshold, filing is more expensive than doing. If it takes longer, there are 3 options. Delegate it if someone else should do it, and if you need to remember that you are waiting on them, record it on a waiting for list along with the date. Defer it to a specific time, in which case it goes on the calendar. Or defer it to be done as soon as you can, in which case it goes on a next actions list. Follow this logic all the way through, and every item you have ever captured ends up in one of 8 places: the trash, someday or maybe, reference, a projects list with an outcome and a next action defined, done immediately under the 2-minute rule. Delegated and tracked on waiting for, on a context-based next actions list, or on the calendar. 8 endpoints. No item is permitted to remain ambiguous, and no item is permitted to remain in the inbox. What I find quietly brilliant about this is that it converts an emotional problem into a procedural one. Deciding what to do with your life is hard. Answering "is this actionable, yes or no" is easy. Answering "what is the next physical action" is easy. The method does not resolve your existential ambivalence. It routes around it by asking only questions small enough that you can always answer them. And it turns out that answering enough small questions produces most of the benefit you were hoping to get from the big one. Organizing, in this framework, is not tidying. It is the discipline of making sure that each of those 8 categories has a distinct home and that nothing gets blended. The calendar carries only what Alan calls the hard landscape, things that must happen on a specific day or at a specific time, and information relevant to that day. This is a stricter rule than most people follow. The common habit of scattering aspirational tasks across future dates corrupts the calendar, because once you have learned that most of what is on today's calendar will not actually happen today, you stop believing any of it. A calendar that only ever tells the truth is worth far more than one that carries your hopes. Next actions are kept on lists sorted by context, meaning the tool, place, or circumstance required to do them. Calls. Errands. Things needing a particular person. Things requiring focused desk time. The logic is that when you have a free 20 minutes and a phone, you want to see only the things you could actually do with a phone in 20 minutes, not a monolithic list of everything you have ever committed to, most of which is currently impossible. A single undifferentiated master list is demoralizing precisely because most of it is irrelevant at any given moment, and scanning past the irrelevant costs attention every time. The project's list is an index, not a plan. Its only job is to guarantee that nothing with multiple steps quietly stalls, and the review of that list asks one question of each entry. Does this have a next action defined? A project without a next action is a project that is not moving, and you will not notice unless you look. Waiting for is the list I would defend most strongly to a skeptic. It is where you record everything you have handed to someone else, with the date you handed it over. It is a small piece of bookkeeping that eliminates an entire genre of anxiety, the one where you are not sure whether the ball is in your court, and it makes following up a matter of routine rather than confrontation. Someday or maybe holds everything you are not committing to now, and it is essential rather than decorative. Without it, the only way to get something off your active list is to abandon it entirely, which feels like a loss, so people keep dead projects on their live lists indefinitely out of sentiment. Someday or maybe is a graceful exit that is not a deletion. The revised edition is realistic about how contexts have shifted. When almost every action can be performed from the same rectangle of glass, dividing by physical location loses some of its power. The underlying principle survives, though. The point was never the specific categories, it was that you should only be looking at what you could plausibly act on right now. Energy level, available time, and mode of thinking are all legitimate ways to slice a list, and in a world where location constrains us less, those matter more. Of the 5 steps, this is the one that separates people who benefit from this book from people who own it. A system built out of external lists has a failure mode. It decays silently. Items get captured and never clarified, projects lose their next actions, the someday list fossilizes, and within about 3 weeks your trusted system is no longer trusted. At which point your mind quietly resumes the background worrying it had agreed to stop. The only defense is regular, deliberate review. Alan prescribes a weekly review of the whole system. Get the inboxes to empty. Review the calendar backward for loose ends and forward for what is coming. Walk the project's list and confirm each has a next action. Scan the next action lists and clear what is done. Check waiting for. Skim someday or maybe and pull anything that has become live. Do a fresh mind sweep for whatever has accumulated in your head during the week. It takes an hour or 2. Almost nobody does it. And I think the reason is instructive. The weekly review is the only part of the method that produces no immediate visible output. Capturing feels good. Doing feels good. The 2-minute rule feels great. Reviewing feels like housekeeping, and it competes directly with actual work for the same scarce block of quiet time, and it always loses that competition unless you protect it. But the review is not maintenance. It is the mechanism by which the system earns the right to be trusted. Your mind's willingness to let go of an item is not a one-time grant. It is a continuously renewed judgment based on evidence. If you look at everything every week, the evidence accumulates and the letting go becomes real. If you do not, no amount of elegant list structure will help you, because you will be maintaining a filing cabinet rather than a second brain. This is also where the method quietly becomes strategic. Reviewing your full inventory of commitments once a week is the only reliable moment at which you can see the shape of your own life. You notice that 11 of your 30 projects belong to a part of your job you do not care about. You notice the thing that has been on the list for 8 months. That noticing is not scheduled, but it is not accidental either. It is what regular contact with the whole picture produces. You have captured, clarified, organized, and reviewed. Now, in a given moment, what do you do? Alan offers 4 criteria, applied in order. Context, meaning what can you even do from where you are with what you have. Time available, meaning what fits before the next fixed commitment. Energy available, which is the criterion most systems ignore entirely and which in practice governs more of our behavior than we admit. There are tasks you simply cannot do at 4 in the afternoon. And pretending otherwise produces guilt rather than output. And only then priority. Priority coming last is deliberate and often misread. It does not mean priority is unimportant. It means priority is the last filter, applied to the set of things that are actually possible right now. Ranking the impossible as theater. He also distinguishes 3 kinds of work that compete throughout a day. Doing predefined work, meaning the things already on your lists. Doing work as it shows up, meaning the interruptions and emergent demands. And defining your work, meaning the processing and clarifying that turns raw stuff into decided actions. The third one is invisible and always the first to be sacrificed, and sacrificing it is exactly what causes the backlog that makes everything else feel unmanageable. A day that consists entirely of reacting is a day that adds to tomorrow's load. Above the daily level, Allen sketches several horizons of perspective, running from the runway of current actions up through current projects, areas of ongoing responsibility, 1 to 2 year goals, longer-range vision. And finally, purpose and principles. He is candid that most of us cannot think clearly at the higher altitudes while the lower ones are in chaos. This is his answer to the standard objection that the method is small-minded, obsessed with the trivial. His position is that you cannot meaningfully contemplate your life's purpose, while some part of you is worrying about whether you renewed the car insurance. Clear the runway first, not because the runway matters most, but because it is the thing making noise. There is a piece of the book that gets less attention than the lists and deserves more, which is Allen's model of how projects should be thought through. He observes that the brain plans naturally and effortlessly all the time. Deciding to go to dinner involves purpose, a picture of the outcome, a spray of ideas, some organization, and a first step, all in a few seconds without conscious effort. What we call planning in an organizational setting often inverts this, starting with structure and process before anyone has agreed what success looks like or why it matters. His model restores the natural sequence. Start with purpose, the why. Then principles, the standards and constraints that any acceptable solution must respect. Then vision, a concrete picture of the successful outcome, which is the step most often skipped and the one that does the most work, because the mind is extraordinarily good at finding paths to a destination it can actually see. Then brainstorming, ungoverned and uncritical. Then organizing, sorting what emerged into sequence and components. And only then the next action. The diagnostic value here is real. If a project feels stuck and you cannot tell why, this model gives you somewhere to look. Too many ideas and no structure means you need organizing. No ideas means you need a clearer picture of the outcome. A clear outcome that nobody is motivated by means you have not established purpose. It is a small tool, but it converts the useless feeling of being stuck into a specific, addressable question. I want to be honest about the limits, because the book's most devoted readers are sometimes not. What it gets right is the cognitive foundation. The claim that undecided commitments consume attention and that externalizing them properly frees it holds up well. The insistence on the physical next action is, in my judgment, the single most useful piece of practical advice in the entire productivity genre, and it is worth adopting even if you take nothing else. The 2-minute rule is trivially implementable and immediately effective. The bottom-up approach, starting with the mess rather than with your values, is psychologically astute in a way that top-down goal-setting frameworks usually are not. Where it strains is on the question of what you should be doing at all. GD is deliberately, almost proudly, agnostic about the content of your commitments. It will help you execute 1,000 trivial things with beautiful efficiency, and it has no strong opinion about whether you should be doing any of them. The higher horizons are gestured at rather than developed, and they arrive late, after hundreds of pages of mechanics. A reader could faithfully implement this system and become an exquisitely organized person running fast in a direction they never chose. Later writers pushed back on precisely this, arguing for elimination over organization, or for protecting long, uninterrupted stretches of concentration rather than optimizing the gaps between interruptions. Those critiques land. The most efficient possible processing of your inbox is still not the same thing as doing important work. The second strain is overhead. The system has a maintenance cost that scales with the number of commitments, and there is a real failure mode, common among enthusiasts, in which tending the system becomes a satisfying substitute for doing the work. The elaborate list architecture provides a steady drip of the feeling of productivity, which is dangerous precisely because it is pleasant. Alan would say a well-run system is nearly frictionless, and for people who have genuinely internalized it, that seems to be true, but the path there is littered with people who spent 6 months choosing an app. The third is that the method assumes a certain shape of life. It suits knowledge workers with high autonomy, many small commitments, and control over their own time. It fits less naturally for people whose work is largely assigned and scheduled by others, or whose lives are dominated by a few enormous efforts rather than hundreds of discrete actions. A novelist does not have an inbox problem. None of this is disqualifying. It is just a reminder that this is a book about the mechanics of commitment, not a philosophy of a good life, and it is at its best when read that way. The mental load you carry is not proportional to how much work you have. It is proportional to how much you have left undecided. Deciding is the relief, not doing. Your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. Anything you are trying to remember is consuming capacity you could be using to think. Get it out completely into a system you actually check. The next action is the hinge. Most stalled tasks are stalled because they are vague nouns rather than physical actions. Convert them, and much of the resistance disappears on its own. Distinguish a project from an action. Anything requiring 2 or more steps needs both an outcome you can describe in a sentence and a defined next step, or it will silently stop moving. If it takes less than 2 minutes, do it now. Tracking it costs more than doing it. Keep your inbox as a doorway, never a to-do list. Empty it regularly, where emptying means every item has been decided about, not finished. Protect the calendar for things that genuinely must happen at a specific time. A calendar you can believe completely is worth more than one carrying your aspirations. Track what you are waiting on from other people. It is a small piece of bookkeeping that removes a disproportionate amount of low-grade worry. Give yourself a someday or maybe list, so that setting something down does not require pretending it never mattered. Do the weekly review. It is the step everyone skips and the one that makes the rest real, because trust in a system is not granted once, it is re-earned every time you look at everything. Choose what to do by context, time, and energy first, and priority last. Ranking things you cannot currently do is a way of feeling busy without being useful. And remember what the system is not. It will make you reliable. It will not tell you what is worth being reliable about. That question is yours, and it is best asked from a clear head, which is exactly what the method is for. The promise at the heart of this book is smaller than the productivity industry's usual offer and, I think, more honest. Alan is not promising that you will do more. He is promising that you will stop being haunted. That is worth pausing on, because the haunting is the real cost of modern work. Not the hours. The way the hours follow you home. The way a Saturday afternoon is degraded by an item you cannot name but can feel. The way rest fails to restore because some part of the mind stayed at the desk, guarding a list it never wrote down. What the method offers is a trade. You accept a certain amount of unglamorous procedure, capturing, clarifying, filing, reviewing, and in exchange you get permission to stop carrying everything. It is not a heroic bargain. There is no moment of transformation, no morning where you wake up a different person. There is just an accumulating sense that when you decide to think about something, it is because you chose to, and when you decide not to, it stays quiet. Alan calls the resulting state something like a mind that responds to what is in front of it, appropriately and without residue, and then returns to stillness. Whether anyone achieves that consistently is doubtful. But I have never met anyone who tried this seriously and got nothing. Even the partial version, even just the next action and the 2-minute rule and an occasional honest look at everything you have said yes to, changes the texture of a week. And if you take only one thing from all of this, take the exercise from the very beginning, because it costs nothing and it works. Pick the thing that is nagging you right now. Write down what done would look like in one sentence. Write down the very next physical thing you would do. Then notice what happens in your chest. Nothing has been accomplished. You have simply stopped carrying a question you were never going to answer at 2 in the morning. That small release, repeated across every commitment in your life, is the entire promise of the book. It turns out that most of what we call being overwhelmed is really just being undecided, at volume, for a very long time.